The wind coming off the Charles carried the smell of hot brick and wet timber down Commonwealth Avenue, past the iron fence and the budding trees on the mall. Traffic slowed to a crawl around the corner at Dartmouth as people rolled down their windows and pointed. The old white-stone hotel with its mansard roof, the Vendome, breathed out ribbons of tan smoke from the upper floors. Sirens converged from every direction. Hoses snaked across the pavement and disappeared through the arched entry like veins. It was Saturday, June 17th, 1972, a warm afternoon that felt like summer had just decided to stay. Inside, where the building had been under renovation for months, the fire found hidden chases and old dust, and the kind of spaces architects sketch cleanly, but a century of alterations turns into a maze. Firefighters climbed the stairs into that heat as the street below settled into a watching hush. The Vendome had been Boston's showpiece 100 years earlier, Parisian lines, a tower that watched the Back Bay grow up around it. Years and owners changed it. By 1972, workers were gutting and remaking floors to turn the old hotel into condominiums and shops, with a restaurant already open at street level. Cast iron columns, masonry walls, added steel, new duct openings where old diagrams said there weren't any. Everything inside carried a story and a load. Out on the mall, when the first engines arrived, the incident commander saw fire showing on upper floors and ordered more companies. Ladders swung up. Crews advanced. In the basement, water pooled and ran toward drains. On the first floor, restaurant patrons craned their necks until a line of uniformed officers moved them back, and then back again. Inside the stairwells, the air tasted like copper and plaster. Lines pushed down hallways where half-finished walls made angles that trapped heat. Companies moved floor by floor, taking windows, opening up ceilings, chasing smoke the way you follow a draft through a keyhole. "We've got it," men shouted over the radio, a phrase that rides in on confidence and leaves on caution. Above them, the light changed with every door forced. In the renovation zones, new shafts cut for ducts, and chases turned smoke into rivers. In the older section, the bones of 1872 still held, stone that remembered fires and storms, cast iron that looked invincible if you didn't know its temperament. Hoses hissed, nozzles hammered. You could feel it on the street. Momentum. By late afternoon, the fire was declared under control. Companies went to work on the quiet, dangerous part, overhaul feeling for heat in walls, pulling ceilings, checking for relapse. Minutes later, complacency never had a chance to grow, because the building made its decision without warning. At 5:28 p.m., a section of the southeast corner dropped. It was not the cinematic fold of a chimney stack or the slow surrender of a cornice. It was a clean failure that punched down through multiple floors, a 40 by 40-foot bite that swallowed men and tools and air in a single growl. The dust cloud carried the sweet, chalky smell of crushed masonry out onto Commonwealth. People who had been leaning on the fence straightened as if pulled by strings. Radios spiked. A firefighter on the sidewalk yelled a name that didn't come back. The crowd, unsure what it had seen, took a step forward. Officers threw their arms wide and held them back. Above the hole, the white facade looked the same, until you noticed the absence where windows had been. The collapse was a structural story written decades earlier and edited carelessly in the years since. Cast iron columns, superb in compression, are brittle and unforgiving when compromised. Somewhere beneath the first floor, a masonry-bearing wall had been cut for a new door and a duct opening, notched in ways that shifted loads onto margins never meant to carry them. Fire, heat, and then the weight of thousands of gallons of water found the weakness and leaned on it. When the wall failed in bearing and shear, the column above lost its seat, and floors that trusted that column followed gravity. Investigators would later diagram the failure with arrows and stresses and notes in formal language, but the field conclusion was plain. A long history of alterations had made a trap, and the fire and water sprung it. Inside that void were Boston firefighters doing the most routine, dangerous work in the business. Ladders 13, 15, 17, companies with names that sounded like neighborhoods, had men in the area pulling ceilings and checking rooms. The floor went from solid to air. Some rode rubble and bone-white dust down. Some were struck in the first instant and knew nothing more. The silence after the roar was its own alarm. On the street, you could hear individual shouts again, the kind that stretch the names of men you know. A lieutenant stripped off his gloves to dig faster and opened his palm on a shard of glass without noticing. Another crew, faces gray with dust, hauled a man free by his turnout and stepped back to let medics try. The smoke that had looked tamed minutes earlier rolled again at the edges of the hole, as if the building were exhaling hard. Rescue became the only job. Companies that had packed hose started throwing it aside to clear a path. Saw teeth bit into beams, choked, and bit again. Cribbing went in, wood slung hand to hand, because each movement in rubble threatens 3 more. A chief's voice on the radio asked for accountability, and, hearing the silence that answered, started reading a list aloud as if names could build a bridge. Reinforcements roared in. The crowd on the mall had grown quiet in the way crowds do when their role is to witness and pray. The sun slid along the row houses, and the white facade turned golden at the top, while the hole in the corner stayed the color of absence. Word moved fast in a city that treats Back Bay blocks like a small town. Wives started calling firehouses before anyone had an official list to read back. Television trucks nosed in and stopped when they saw faces that told them not today. Priests and ministers appeared as if conjured by the sound of sirens lingering too long in one place. Crews worked in shifts but didn't really stop, sweating through dusty coats and drinking water that tasted like stone. When a body came out, men straightened involuntarily, made a lane, and kept their hands moving because hands are the only thing a person can control in a moment like that. By night, the scene was all hard light and shadow. Generators thumped. The neighborhood smell, restaurants, lilacs, hot pavement, had been replaced by plaster and old wood. Faces were streaked where tears cut through dust, and nobody mentioned it. What they mentioned, in the short sentences of practical grief, were the names that would later be etched in bronze: Fire Lieutenants Thomas J. Carroll and John E. Hanbury, Jr., firefighters Thomas W. Beckwith, Joseph E. Boucher, Jr., Charles E. Dolan, John E. Jameson, Richard B. Magee, Paul J. Murphy, and Joseph P. Sanyuk. 9 men. The largest single loss in the history of the Boston Fire Department. A count no one who wore the patch wanted to say out loud and yet had to, for the record, for the families, for the truth of the day. In the days that followed, the investigation was careful and unsparing. The origin of the fire itself remained uncertain. It might have started in concealed spaces on upper floors, a byproduct of renovation work in a building laced with cavities and old materials. But the deadly moment, the collapse, was traced to structural compromises. A bearing wall cut and weakened over years by openings, a cast iron column whose load path had been altered, heavy water from firefighting adding transient weight to floors. Engineers described stresses that had been excessively high even before the day's events, a condition that required only a nudge to become failure. The nudge arrived. Boston adjusted around the hole in its heart. Funerals moved in sequence, a procession of families and uniforms and pipes. The city measured the tragedy in numbers that were terrible because they were domestic. 8 widows, more than 20 children, Father's Day on the doorstep with an empty chair at every one of their tables. Firehouses learned to hold silence at a particular time in June. On Commonwealth Avenue, a memorial rose within sight of the southeast corner. 9 bronze helmets arranged with names so that passers-by could make the connection between the beautiful white facade and the plain arithmetic of risk. Building codes and practices shifted too. Inspectors learned to regard old buildings under renovation as something new, neither entirely what they had been nor what the drawings said they would become. Contractors learned, again, that every hole cut into brick and stone has a cost carried somewhere else. Incident commanders became more suspicious of the word overhaul, less willing to stack people on marginal floors simply because flame had given way to smoke. The lesson was ugly and simple. Buildings that survive fire don't always survive what the fire does to their bones. If you stand there today, the Vendome is polished and quiet, its commercial spaces bright, its residential buzz internal, and the traffic along Dartmouth and Commonwealth polite until it isn't. But the corner still holds the memory perfectly. The geometry remains: white stone, mansard roof, the curb line where the hoses once lay. On a June afternoon, when the light turns the facade warm, it is not hard to picture the street as it was. The iron fence crowded with onlookers, firefighters moving with the steady urgency that comes from a job measured in minutes. The moment when control turned to collapse, and a city learned again how thin the border is between routine danger and irreversible loss. What happened at the Vendome reads like a paradox only if you don't understand buildings and fire. The blaze was beaten, the structure was not. The fire seemed over because flames were out and smoke had thinned. But the weight of water had climbed into joists, heat had unseated old strengths, and alterations had left a load path waiting for a final straw. At 5:28 p.m., the straw landed. On the mall, the crowd gasped. In the void, 9 men fell. The department pulled them out with the same stubbornness they had brought to 1,000 smaller calls, and the city built something permanent to say they had not been forgotten. Thank you for listening to Road to Ruins. Subscribe for more true stories where systems fail and people pay the price.